Greetings. So, on Facebook, I found this very funny group, the Freedom from Atheism Foundation. So obviously a pro-religious group and also a parody of the Freedom from Religious Foundation. However, while that is an actual foundation that gets donations and things like that, this is really just a web page of religious people bitching about public atheists. Now, it is quite funny. I mean, the various logical fallacies in these people's pro-religion, anti-atheist arguments, complaints about atheists being intolerant, you know, the usual stuff about that. But one thing that I found really funny, and I'll scroll down to see if I can get to one of the things. It's, oh, you like the scientific method, thank a medieval Catholic Franciscan friar. Oh, you like genetics, thank an Augustinian Catholic monk. That being Friar Gregor Johann Mandel, Father Georges Lemaitre. If I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, I apologize. Oh, you like the Big Bang Theory, thank you, Catholic priest. So there's a couple things like this on the page. They're basically saying that religious people are responsible for modern scientific theories, or scientific theories are still accepted in whole or in part today. That's fine. The problem is that they're drawing conclusions from this to support them. They're basically saying that because religious people came up with scientific principles, that religion has to be either scientifically viable, or that religion is not anti-science, or that science is not anti-religion, or that religion and science are compatible. That's what they're arguing. And then there's things like this, like atheism good enough for these guys. Now, if you discount Hitler, who wasn't an atheist, and you discount a couple of these guys, what you're looking at are a collection of people who are ostensibly communist. I mean, I would argue that, you know, some of the dictators of supposed communist states, like Stalin and stuff, weren't actually socialist or communist, whatever, but put aside definitions and whether people are true or not about that. And basically what I'm saying is this site is very anti-socialist, it's very anti-communist. Here's the thing. They put up all of these pictures of religious figures, priests, monks, whatever, who were responsible for religious theories. And then they're saying, oh, you like that scientific theory? Well, thank a religious person. And then they're trying to essentially draw these conclusions implicitly about religion and science. There is a problem with that, though, if you are the Freedom from Atheism Foundation. A man named Archie Brown wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Communism, and it is a history book that basically goes through the entire history of communist thought. And the history of governments that have called themselves communist. Archie Brown is certainly not a communist or a socialist. He has not really any affinity for the ideology of socialism and communism, so when I read passages from this book or quote him, don't say that he must be just a pro-communist person. That's why he's saying it. He's not. And the conclusion of this book makes it quite clear. Democracies, once firmly established, are remarkably resilient. Consolidated democracies are hardly ever exchanged for a form of authoritarian rule, and however imperfectly they function, they have shown themselves more capable of delivering justice as well as freedom than any state built on the foundation laid by Marx and Lenin. So not exactly a book written by someone sympathetic to communist or socialist thought. See, what a lot of people, usually religious anti-socialist or anti-communist people, don't realize is that the earliest communists, or the earliest proponents of any sort of egalitarian view or societal view that would line up with later communist thought, began with religious people, priests, monks, people going back to the 1300s. Or even further, actually. People seem to think that communism or socialism or any sort of thought like that began with Marx and Engels, if they even know who Engels is. Reading from the book. In medieval times, social reformers looked back to the early Christians as examples of people who held everything in common. The prominent German historian Max Beer argued that even if it may fairly be doubted whether positive communistic institutions really existed amongst the primitive Christian communities, there cannot be any doubt that common possessions were looked upon by many of the first Christians as an ideal to be aimed at. Indeed, according to the Acts of the Apostles, the disciples of Jesus, quoting here, were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. In the second half of the 4th century, St. Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, the mentor of St. Augustine, declared, quoting, "Nature has poured forth all things for all men to be held in common." Common ownership! For God commanded all things to be produced so that food should be common to all, and that the earth should be a common possession of all. Nature therefore created a common right, but use and habit created private right. Many 14th century Christian theologians, among them the English church reformer John Wycliffe, assumed that the earliest form of human society was one of innocence and communism. Innocence and communism is in quotes. Indeed, on occasion, Wycliffe contended that, quote, all good things of God ought to be in common. Emphasis was added in the book for ought. He didn't emphasize that, but it seems to match there. And then there's the case of the revolutionary priest John Ball. It says here, Priest John Ball, who years before the peasants' revolt of 1381 in England had occupied himself inflaming the peasantry against the lords temporal and spiritual, Ball was regarded as an instigator of that major revolt from which he was executed in the same year. An extract from one of the speeches, said to have been delivered by him, exemplifies his radical but religiously based egalitarianism. To quote, "Things cannot go well in England, nor ever will, until all goods are held in common, and until there will be neither serfs nor gentlemen, and we shall all be equal. For what reason have they, whom we call lords, got the best of us? How did they deserve it? Why do they keep us in bondage? If we all descended from one father and one mother, Adam and Eve, how can they assert or prove that they are more masters than ourselves, except perhaps that they make us work and produce for them to spend?" Sounds pretty Marxist for someone who died in 1381. Or this Thomas Muntzer, who Wikipedia says he thought that the questioning of authority promoted by the Lutheran Reformation should be applied to the economic sphere. According to Archie Brown's book here, a more erudite advocate of a new social order to be achieved by violent means, revolutionary commie, was Thomas Muntzer, whose active proselytizing began a decade or so later than that of the revolutionary of the Upper Rhine. He was to earn the approval in the 19th century of Friedrich Engels, who wrote, "The mystics of the Middle Ages who dreamed of the coming millennium were already conscious of the injustice of class antagonisms. On the threshold of modern history 350 years ago, Thomas Muntzer proclaimed it to the world." Muntzer did his utmost, not quoting anymore here, but this is Brown. Muntzer did his utmost to stir up the peasantry against the nobility and the ecclesiastical establishment. It was not, obviously, his belief in an imminent second coming that appealed to some 19th century revolutionaries, including Engels, but his commitment to class war. Muntzer played a part in encouraging peasant insurrection in 16th century Germany in rhetoric which was violent and uncompromising. Of course, no discussion would be complete without Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, Sir Thomas More. He imagined a sort of communist society in his book Utopia that was published back in 1516. One of his quotes here is, I'm quite convinced that you'll never get a fair distribution of goods or a satisfactory organization of human life until you abolish private property altogether. So long as it exists, the vast majority of the human race and the vastly superior part of it will inevitably go on laboring under a burden of poverty, hardship, and worry. That's a pretty succinct socialist thought. Lastly here we have Tommaso Campanella, a Italian philosopher, theologian, astrologer, and poet, according to Wikipedia, who died in 1639. Archie Brown describes him as an Italian Dominican monk, who wrote a book called The City of the Sun, or La Città del Sole, published in 1602. Let's see, Campanella sees the family, quoting Brown now, Campanella sees the family as the main obstacle to the creation of a communistic state and holds that parents, for the most part, educate their children wrongly and that the state must, therefore, be responsible for their education. So much for those private Catholic schools. He stresses the dignity of work, although in his City of the Sun, working hours have been reduced to 4 a day, which much of the rest of the time devoted to learning joyously. That sounds very much like either Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner, or that sort of a Marxist idea of like a 4 or 6 hour work day and people just sort of being able to enjoy themselves later on. My point is this. If you're going to post anti-socialist things or anti-communist things on your religious webpage, but then post pictures of old priests and monks who created scientific theories, thereby saying that A, communism is bad because it's atheist, and B, that that religion is good because there are scientific religious people in the past, then you have to not ignore the idea that prior to Marx, prior to Engels, prior to Lenin, or anyone else in the socialist or communist movements, the first socialists and communists, or the people preaching egalitarian thoughts and writing things that sounded a lot like what Marx would later write, were also religious. When rather than a post that says, hey, if you like genetics, thank a priest, or if you like the Big Bang Theory, thank a priest, or whatever, you should probably put, hey, do you like Revolutionary War for class struggle? Thank a priest from the 1600s. It's amazing what some religious people don't know about socialism or communism or history or logic or anything, really.